Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for day 5 of our first annual Fair Housing Week. I am Lori Namazi, your 2021 president, and it is my privilege to not only have opened up the week, but also to end the week. So we've had an incredible week of enlightening conversations, wonderful education, and today will be more of the same. So it's my privilege to be hosting this session today on buyer interest letters and other updates related to fair housing with one of my friends, Farah Wilder. And so Farah is the Vice President and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for CAR. And she's also a personal friend of mine. So we have had many conversations around this topic in the last 12 months. So I'm excited to have this conversation publicly with all of our members. I'd like to thank all of the Orange County member realtors and affiliates who are joining us today and have joined us all week, as well as I know we have members from other associations up and down the state. So we're excited to be able to reach so many people and share this great topic. So I'd like to just give a little insight into how I came to know Farah. Farah and I met a few years ago at CAR, where we are both directors. We were both directors, and I actually saw her a couple years before I met her. And I've told her this story, but you know, she was that woman across the room who was fearless and would go to the microphone and very succinctly and very articulately express a point of view that a lot of people in the room would feel, but wouldn't be confident enough to say. Or she'd bring in a different perspective that people weren't thinking about. And so I always admired that about her. And I thought, gosh, she's a brilliant woman. One day I want to meet her. And so fortunately, through a mutual friend, we did have the opportunity to meet, and she was everything I thought she would be. And I was blessed last year that we really got to know each other, really surrounding the conversation of fair housing and social injustice. And so it's my privilege to have this conversation with you, Farah, and to be friends with you. And so let's begin.
Wow, thank you so much, Lori. It's an honor to be here, and also an honor to know you. I've also enjoyed getting to know you better, and also we do really important work together. And you have, a huge role with OC Realtors, and it's just great that we get to continue to support this community together. So thanks so much for having me. And I see a whole bunch of friends in the chat. So hi, friends.
Yes, yes. So we're thrilled to have you here. So, as a way to introduce yourself, tell us about your education and your previous career and your career as a realtor and your life experience that has equipped you for this important role that you hold at CAR.
Um, sure. So the role kind of came about in a surprising way. I know we can go back to last summer when we were all just realtors, and in my volunteer activities, and even whether it's formal or not, I've always been compelled to bring, my personal background, my experiences with my clients. I was a realtor for 13 years in the East Bay area. I also live in Oakland. And most of my clients were people of color or from the LGBTQ community. And I also come from Detroit, Michigan, where we have I think, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I feel like everyone in my family pretty much own their homes. A Black community of homeowners was really my base. And so I was still bringing all that, to my work and my contribution last summer. And before I was a realtor, I should mention, I was a civil rights attorney. I don't know if you mentioned that. And just also just a lifelong social justice advocate, and had that interest. That's what I studied, also in undergrad at the University of Michigan. So it all kind of culminated in giving feedback, particularly around the heightened interest in fair housing that our industry started to have, which was amazing. I mean, did not come from an amazing time. We were in a very difficult time where injustice was laid bare on video, and something that the country was having very difficult conversations about. Industries, including real estate, but other industries were rightfully so, and maybe belatedly having conversations around injustice and inequity. And so just as always, even though I felt there was first of all, we had a crew, we always did, but we had an even bigger crew of a lot of folks who were wanting to have this conversation more and more. It led to the job opening at CAR, and I didn't even think it was something that I should go for. It wasn't something I was trying to do, but it turned out that I applied, and now here I am. So I started that job in September, and now I'm in this role, which is amazing. It feels like it ties everything up in a bow so well, and it's just been a wonderful thing, and really an honor to support this community in this work and on this topic that is so important to so many of us.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an incredible culmination of everything you've worked for in your life up to this point, coming together, converging the social justice legal work that you did and your work as a realtor. It was the perfect combination. So I know when you first announced it to us, we were like proud mamas, just so excited for you, and knew that you were the right person for the role, and especially at the right time. And so, as you talked about the social injustices that were going on, and industries looking at their own industry, examining things, how do you think that we made the leap from talking about fair housing to examining the practice of the buyer love letters, something that we were taught? We were all taught for 2 decades ago that this is something that you can do. This is what can differentiate you. So how did we make that leap from the conversation about social injustice? Obviously, we would look at fair housing, but how do you think that the letters came under the microscope to be examined, and for us to finally recognize, wait, this is harmful, not helpful? How do you think that happened?
So you hit the nail on the head with this. Is something that really was a common practice, because I want to invite all of us to be on this journey of unpacking the things that we do, and untangling kind of the causes of homeownership gaps, and some of the things that we haven't talked about before, haven't really thought about before in our practices and in our business, buyer letters being one of them. And so I think I for one, I have to say, it's not the first time someone had brought up to me that buyer letters could be an issue. And so there were folks, some of our attorneys had cautioned against buyer letters. Folks I knew through NAR were some of them were really not, in other states, maybe they were even discouraging of buyer letters, but it wasn't as big of a conversation until, I would say, there was a spark. And the spark was the Newsday investigation. And after the Newsday investigation showed the level of bias, and that bias came through steering, essentially, and people being treated differently by agents who sincerely thought they were treating everybody the same, but when they were on camera, and when the data came back, it showed that they were showing different people of different races, different communities, or asking for different first qualifications before they'd take them out. So that is an indication of bias. Now, CAR started looking at expanding its analysis, its policy agenda around fair housing right after that time, and also got really concerned about implicit bias. And then when the summer hit, or I would say after the murder of George Floyd, and the summer hit, and the industry was really, really thinking, what can we do? We were talking about the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory, which CAR ended up rolling out. CAR included in the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory, the lawyers took the kind of general parameters that, we were kind of talking about, and included a recommendation around buyer letters. And at first we're like, oh, wait, whoa, wait, hey, and it was like, even me, I was just like, it's really hard to get an offer accepted. And Oakland has been difficult for a long time. I know California has competitive markets. Now every market just about in California is probably as competitive as it's ever been. But, we were all like, oh, wait, not that this wasn't a relevant thing to bring up, but we knew that it was going to cause quite a stir. And so, but it was a conversation that needed to happen, because essentially, and in California, let's remember, we have 22 protected categories. And I hate the term protected categories. I just can't find a better way to describe it. But there are 22 bases or reasons that a seller cannot base their decision on. And so, and because we understand how implicit bias works, sometimes a seller or a realtor or a human doesn't realize that the reason they've done something is because of that category. And what a buyer letter does is it gives information that deviates from the price, the contingencies, the terms of the offer, generally the qualification, all of that. And so it was correct to raise this as a fair housing issue in a fair housing advisory. But of course, as California started to get more and more competitive, it caused a lot of conversation around buyer letters. But that's really how it came about, is because, fair housing is something that we're all committed to. And I would suggest that, our industry is committed to it. I haven't met a realtor who doesn't think fair housing is important, who doesn't want to have a business that follows fair housing principles. And I think as a realtor association, we have to support our community in making sure that they follow fair housing principles. However, there was this huge blind spot around buyer letters. And so it's been a tough one for folks as they grapple with how to get offers accepted in a difficult market.
Right. And, somebody sent me a text message this morning with a news piece from CNBC from today that was actually, how to get your offers accepted. And point number 4 out of 4 was present a letter that you want to elicit emotion from the seller. And so, when agents look at that on the surface, it kind of makes sense. But, as you just described, when you are describing your client, you are exposing those characteristics. And although a buyer may feel, well, but I'm the one disclosing it, so it's okay, what in reality happens is now the seller and the agents are put in a position to say, well, now we know this information. And now if there is an inkling of the choice being made based on those characteristics, then there's a problem. And so, buyers feel that, well, it's my option to share this much information about my life. I'm an open book and I will share everything with you. But what we're forgetting is, on the other side of it, there are decisions that have to be made, and there are those biases that can come into play knowingly or not. And that's the real danger.
It's true. And I think we have to remember that in California, with so many protected categories, and realtors often don't even realize some of the categories that are protected, but there's one that's any arbitrary characteristic. Okay, so that's really broad, right? Like, I have tattoos, I have blue hair, I live close, I want to live close to work, or whatever it is, could be, a basis that's arbitrary. So, I'm going to say this is not legal advice. If you have a question about specific legalities around these things, we do have a hotline you can call. But what I will say is that you want to be really careful, because you're into the territory of those reasons that are prohibited for selecting a buyer. And let's remember fair housing history. And so we had a discussion on an excellent book that I really highly recommend people. If you listen to it, it's less expensive because the hardcover is the only other option. But look up Levittown, and it has a really longer name after the Levittown piece of it. But we were going back to a time where people had gotten together and they were deciding based on a characteristic who could live in their neighborhood or who could not, who would they sell their properties to, and the result of doing that is that wholesale groups of people were largely barred from entire communities, from homeownership, from the opportunity to build equity. We have huge racial homeownership gaps, and housing is so incredibly important. So when you think about a seller having that much power over the rest of someone's life, how they're going to live, whether they're going to be a homeowner or not, it makes absolute sense that those arbitrary characteristics are not really appropriate as a reason to choose or not to choose a buyer for your house or the next homeowner for your home.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a comment in the chat asking about, is a summary of highlights stated in the offer to the seller agent only a love letter?
No.
The answer is no.
No. So the character, those are appropriate bases for deciding to accept or not accept an offer. And so listing them out, even if they're outside of the contract form, you're essentially summarizing the contract. It would be the same as if the listing agent called the buyer's agent and asked, tell me more about this offer, and you listed everything verbally. It's the exact same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had Lee Brown on earlier this week, and in her presentation, she did discuss the letters very passionately about the letters. And, she gave the advice that we've been hearing across the industry is focus on the qualification of the buyer. What are their terms? This is the price, this many days escrow, contingencies or not. If you wanted to throw in something about why they love the property, that would be okay, but really keep it factual and not about the buyers themselves.
And I would add that there are ways to really position yourself to hopefully get that offer accepted. When your buyer first is interested in a property, make a phone call, be easy to reach, be professional, kind of present a clean offer, present it in the way that they've asked you to present it, follow the instructions, all of those things that kind of help, put you and your client in a positive light, and not with respect to demographics, but with respect to the fact that, this is someone who has met the requirements that have been laid out for this offer. Make the cleanest offer you can. I mean, it's okay as a buyer's agent to ask what is the level of interest in this property, using all of the information that you might glean about what you might need to do terms wise to really assist your buyer, and then have a conversation with the buyer and with the lender and see if there's a way to really make the cleanest offer possible.
It's such an important point, picking up the phone and calling the agent. We know when an agent is getting bombarded with requests for showings, they may not answer the phone, but it makes all the difference in the world. And I'll share a quick story I've shared in other venues. Last year, my youngest daughter was looking for a property, and just like all of the other buyers, were met with the competition. It was during COVID, so we had those dynamics to deal with, restrictions on showings and all of the PPE that we had to wear in order to do the showings. We were very compliant, of course, but we were getting overbid. We were getting outbid. And on this fourth property that we put in an offer, we were the first buyers to see it, and we were the first ones to submit an offer. But I did exactly what you mentioned. I called the listing agent and asked, what does the seller need to see in this offer? And I knew there was going to be interest. I knew it. So I wanted to make that personal connection. I did let that agent know that I would be sending over an offer. And something I think a lot of agents forget is they sometimes forget to notify the agent that they've sent the offer.
Yeah.
Sometimes the email address is in the MLS is not the one they want the offers going to. So you need to notify them that you've sent it. And I did that by sending it via email with my own cover letter. I didn't send anything from my buyer. But my subject line was, X% over list price, offer attached. So that immediately got their attention. And in the body of the email, I explained, here's why they're qualified. And I sent a text message and a voicemail. Now, not like a stalker, but just to, very pleasantly to let them know, hey, we're very excited about this property and we want you to know. And a couple days of negotiation, and they did get other offers. At the end of the day, that listing agent called me and said, you were not the highest offer, but we want to work with you. And that agent didn't know me. She is a member of another board, so it's not like she knew me from the board. But it was about that communication, that very positive, healthy, helpful communication. And so that matters too.
It does. And we have to, I think what we have to remember is that, it's the little things. It's, kind of thinking what would make this person's life easier, even though they've gotten, 10 offers, so how can I stand out, but also, make it easy for them to understand what's in the offer. The summary is great. I always, as a realtor, when I was a realtor, I would list all the terms. I put on do a little cover letter, put the lender's name and phone number and email address, like right on the front. It's just kind of that small extra touch that you might do to make it easy for this person to understand the offer, and maybe have them thinking, you know what, this is going to close. This is going to be easy. It's going to be smooth, and I really have had a good interaction with this agent so far.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes all the difference. And the lender calling as well. Our lender did that. They were great. They were part of the team that got my buyer that house. And so, my daughter was thrilled to have a new home for Christmas.
Well, she had an amazing agent.
Thank you. But you know what? It's so fascinating to be able to experience it and hear, through the different groups that you and I both belong to. We hear all the stories, so we hear some of the best practices. So are there any other best practices that you would recommend? I know we've already covered several.
Yeah, sure. So I'm just like, I have like a list. But before we go there, and this is something that's not on my list, but we've talked about, I would say, some agents have a habit of, and this goes both ways, the buyer's agent will sometimes ask for kind of demographic information about the seller so that they can, kind of coach their buyer around the demographics, around letter. And then you've got sometimes the seller and maybe listing agent, kind of coming back and asking for more information than what's in the offer about the buyer. And I would say that, maybe a custom and a common practice to do that, but those are things that would lead to making decisions upon inappropriate basis. So I just want to kind of highlight that. But other things, so you said things that people want to do in their business. I would say, and I know that you had an implicit bias trainer on during this week. Learn about implicit bias one way or the other. If you didn't have a chance to take that training, I have heard that NAR is going to do like a pilot implicit bias CE course. There's probably going to be some CE courses coming through California too, as there's a law that's in front of our state lawmakers, might get passed, that's potentially going to require implicit bias training as a part of your licensing. So, and not just because it's part of your licensing, but because implicit bias and understanding implicit bias will help us. Everyone has implicit bias, as Rudier really states really well. He really unpacks that. This is how our brains work. And so as professionals, what we need to do is figure out ways to kind of understand those things and then take a step back and modify our businesses so it doesn't creep into our practices. So buyer letters being one of them, having consistent systems is another. When you meet a buyer, every single buyer, even if it's your friend, do the exact same thing, have the exact same list of questions, make sure that the neighborhoods come from them, the areas come from them. So just ask them, where do they want to live? Do the exact same thing. Think about how you're talking about schools. Agents love to be the answer folks. We love to be the person who has the inspector, who knows the neighborhoods, who knows the this, the this. This should all come from our clients. So it's not a bad thing to help someone be near something they want to be close to, or be in a region that's going to allow for their children to go to a certain school, but it shouldn't come from realtors. So, and this is because we're potentially putting our own bias and our own spin on something. Potentially it's steering. And you think about some of the things that lead to bias. Unfortunately, people have biases around the racial composition of a school or a neighborhood. And that could perpetuate, these kind of patterns of valuing neighborhoods based on race, of segregation. So what we want to do is whenever you're asked about schools, and this is a tough one, it's tough when I talk to realtors about this because we're so used to doing it, is say, you know what, everybody has a different idea of what a good school is. When people ask for a good neighborhood, good school, those are very subjective. And so what I would invite you to do, just because it actually could be a fair housing violation in a sense, if I start recommending certain things and I recommend this to you and someone else, is I'm going to say, you've got to do your own research. And wherever you decide, and there are ways you can do it, there are websites, there are reviews, you can talk to parents, you can interview and visit schools. Wherever you decide, we will figure out where's the parameters, and that we can focus your home search there. Think about the terms you use for neighborhoods. So I think, Lori, we've probably had this conversation before where we talk about how people say a neighborhood is sketchy, or it's coming up, or it's getting better, or it's going down, or something like that. So again, this is an opinion. And sometimes people have particular bias or their own kind of subjective reasons for thinking a neighborhood is this or that. But when you communicate it to a client, that client ends up then, having that particular opinion where they might not have had it before. And so it's really up to the buyer or the potential client to really determine, where do they want to live. We don't want to inadvertently, be steering or be suggesting that people all go to certain neighborhoods and avoid other neighborhoods. And then I guess finally, I would say it's important to think about, let's see. I have so many things. Yeah, I would say also another thing just in general, and this is within our community, it's kind of an idea that for whatever reason people have, equating affordable housing or housing affordability with something beyond people who make less money or people who have less money. And many people could have less money in a market that's really, really expensive and really becoming rapidly unaffordable for your average resident of a community. So a lot of folks have negative views about affordable housing. There are people who will suggest that there's something they'll ascribe more things than just that it costs less to it. So I would say as realtors, and especially as we're advising our investor clients, or for folks who are looking at different neighborhoods and there might be, a subsidized community in there, we really need to, think about how we talk about affordable housing so that we're not perpetuating stereotypes that are inappropriate and not necessarily true, about a certain community.
Right, you're so right, and we have a couple of questions and comments related to a couple of things you already touched on. When it comes to school demographics, crime rate, I like to tell people be the source of a source. Don't be the source yourself, but point them in the right direction of where they can find this information, because exactly what you mentioned, it's subjective. We all have different lenses that we look through things through, and we will um, consider, what I might consider safe may not be what you consider safe, or vice versa. And so, it's not for us to judge. And even with the schools, as you mentioned, there are a ton of resources, community resources that we can direct these potential buyers to, so that they can be better informed, and that protects us. I almost feel at that point, we forget our industry. We're helpers. We always just want to help people, but when we help people, we can get ourselves into trouble. And that's what we need to remember, is our goal is to make sure that we're providing the source for them to make those decisions, but we are taking them wherever they ask us to take them. And so it's a delicate line. And then there's another question about the rental application. It's a really good question. It says the landlord would like to know more about who will be living in their property. Well, I don't have the application layout memorized, but my recollection is, it asks who are the other adults. So who is the applicant and who are the other adults, and then list any children. So we should be okay with that. I mean, other than the names, and the names being on the applications is another big question, but we'll put that aside for a second. I believe it's only asking you for the names of adults and the names of the children, and not anything else about them.
And remember that there are 22 bases that cannot be the reason that someone denies someone the ability to rent their property. So, there's only so much that's even appropriate to I would say no, and then base the decision on. And familial status, the number of kids, as long as it's not exceeding the required maximum of a community, preferring single or childless individuals over families is actually something that California law may prohibit. So I would say that, what they might want to know is, that they are able to afford the rent, and there's ways that can be sussed out, and do they have the funds for the first and last rent and deposit? But aside from that, what other information would they need to know that would fall outside of the 22 protected categories?
Absolutely. We have a comment regarding your being correct about the affordable housing subject. It is something that we grapple with, because the overall affordability in the state is low. I mean, I'd love to live in Laguna Beach, but I can't afford it. And so, we can't just say affordable housing is for people who lack funds, because there are areas that I simply can't afford. And, so, we've had a good conversation about some of the best practices, what we should and shouldn't do. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the resources that CAR has provided to us, and even some of them that are from NAR?
Sure. And I just want to kind of back up and say, when we talk about knowing who's going to be renting, the apartment and all of that, just remember that there is so much power in that decision. There's so much power to determine someone's outcome. And there are folks for that, let's just say source of income, for example, discrimination, who, if it was legal to discriminate on the basis of something like source of income, and people decided they didn't like this particular source of income, who would have a very difficult time with literally with their housing. And so we're talking about something that is so important. We're in a affordability and a housing crisis, and it's really important to make sure that realtors and to the extent that we have control over it, any of our clients, are not perpetuating some of these inequities. So so some resources. So we do a lot of education. Where can I read more about the 22 protected categories? Before I go into the resources, that is an excellent question. The Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory is the cover page for the purchase agreement, the listing agreement, and the rental agreement, in the contracts, the forms. So you'll be able to see that there. You can also find a copy of that on CAR's website. If you look up the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory, any list of the standard forms will have that advisory. So we have forums and webinars, are one of the things that we're doing quite a bit around fair housing to really make sure that we are educating on this topic. And it's a big topic. It definitely goes beyond implicit bias and buyer letters. It covers so many things. And so we just had our fair housing and diversity. The D is discrimination in the forum, and diversity when we talk about our forum at the business meetings. And our business meetings, I should mention, are open to everyone. Every realtor, I should say, every realtor can come to the forums, can come to the business meetings. They are listed on CAR's website, and a really good way to kind of find out more about these topics. We also have webinars and forums in between the business meetings. We have the Steps Towards Homeownership program, which talks a lot about, it's an educational program for realtors, and it talks a lot about lending. There's a fair housing component, and it talks about down payment and home buyer assistance programs. I'm going to tell you why that's important, because part of fair housing is the legacy of this past legal discrimination that has led to homeownership gaps, particularly racial homeownership gaps, because it was once, unfortunately, legal to discriminate for a lot of reasons, but based on race. People of color have homeownership gaps when you compare them to the average and oftentimes to white people. And so we have less intergenerational wealth. There's a wealth gap between people of color and white folks. And so learning about first-time home buyer programs can be really helpful as we're trying to address these disparities that resulted from past discrimination. So we have the Steps Towards Homeownership program. Another thing I want to back up before I go through some of the additional resources that I want to recommend that realtors do in their business. This was something I was trying to remember when I was talking before, is that every realtor, even if you don't do first-time buyer programs or down payment assistance programs, should make sure that when a buyer comes to you and they say what they want, and they maybe say their price point, or they say how much money they have, if you think that they're not able to buy, please consider not telling them that they can't buy, connecting them with a HUD-approved housing counselor or a lender that does down payment assistance programs, so that person stays in the loop. As we know, the market is getting more and more expensive. Interest rates are going up, and you want to make sure that you are not where someone's home search ended if there was some sort of possibility that they could have bought a home, because this is particularly damaging for people of color who may have less resources and less generational wealth. So always make sure you have that resource to send someone to, even if you just do listings or you just work with investors. Okay, back to resources. If you look at the most recent issue of the California Real Estate Magazine, it's all about fair housing. We're beefing up our fair housing resources online, and I can put all these things in the chat, but on our CAR website, you'll see our fair housing portion of the website has tons and tons of books and resources that you can look at to learn more about it. Let's see.
And there's a great Q&A. Tiffany posted it in the chat for us, but it's on the do's and don'ts of buyer love letters. It's several pages long, but it answers a lot of the questions. Rather, it poses a lot of the questions that sometimes we don't think about. And so then the answers give you a very clear understanding of why there's danger with using the letters and how it can impact. Before you continue, we have a couple other questions in the Q&A that come from Nicole, and she's asking her questions related to rentals. And the reality is we see more discrimination in rentals from the point of view of what is reported to DFEH, and they report that more people are reporting the discriminatory practices in rentals as opposed to in purchases. And so, her questions are about asking if the children have cars. I think, again, that's a matter of how many cars versus who has the cars. It doesn't matter who owns the car, who drives the car, it's how many cars are there. And then the other question she asks, she states she asks if the children go to private school to help calculate the debt to income ratio. And she's willing to call CAR legal on it. I have a thought on that. What do you think, Farah?
Call CAR legal on that. I think, look, I think that gets really into how people are spending their money. And I think that's a lot more than what landlords usually get involved in. I mean, people could be spending money all kinds of different ways. So I would suggest that it gets into a touchy area, because you end up knowing this one thing about this one person and what they're spending money on, and someone else could be spending money on something else that you haven't captured. And so I would call CAR legal, but I'm not sure if you're able to even capture where track all the different ways that the money flows. And one thing I do want to say too about complaints is that what came out in the Newsday investigation that was really interesting is that a lot of times people who are looking to buy a home don't realize they're being discriminated against. So in the rental space, first of all, there's a little bit more fair housing testing that happens. There's a lot of landlord tenant advocacy groups. And unfortunately, there's not, to my knowledge, as robust of support, around home buyers, like someone who's just out meeting a realtor, which is why it's really important that we're a particular kind of steward for home ownership, and we're keeping these concepts front of mind. But we also do not have the ability yet to test to the extent that they did in Long Island, where they did that Newsday investigation. And there are groups that are attempting to get more funding for that, and also who are attempting to change the law to allow for recording of people who didn't consent, just to allow for fair housing testing. And so what I want to put on the group's radar is that testing is a key piece of enforcing fair housing law. Without enforcement, the law is pretty useless. You could have a law, but if people can violate it, then there you go. Because realtors may sometimes be acting out of unexamined implicit bias, it's important to learn about this. But there's kind of a spotlight on our industry right now around fair housing, around the steering, around the bias. So I would say that even though we aren't aware of complaints, it's important to keep in mind that any realtor could be tested at any time. All of you might be being tested at this, right at the moment. So keeping in mind, your systems and being consistent is going to be really, really important for making sure that you are not going to be subject to one of these tests. And so we might see more complaints and more scrutiny coming up in the future for the home buying process.
Absolutely. It's such an important point to have those systems in place to make sure that you are consistently doing the same tasks, asking the same questions to all of your clients versus one group over another. And, I'll put in another plug. I did this on Monday, but I'll put in another plug for the Fairhaven simulation. That is a great way to walk in the shoes as an agent presented with scenarios and then they flip it around, and then you become the client experiencing certain scenarios. It's really an eye opener to recognize that some of the things that we might actually be saying um, fall under these danger zones, and we don't even realize, because once again, we're trying to be helpful, we're trying to do the right thing, we're trying to put our own opinions or ideals on our clients. We're projecting our feelings of what I would want onto them. And so that would be a great thing to take. Takes about an hour, and it's very interactive and opens your eyes. One other question we have regarding rentals: 3 kids. The landlord is asking, how old are the kids? So how did I answer that?
I mean, is that familiar? I mean, so again, this is a practicing lawyer, real estate lawyer question, because is that a familial status issue? I can't say, but I would say, and there's age, potentially, that you can't, there are only limited exceptions for being able to discriminate based on age, and usually it's for senior communities. So I would say call legal just to make sure, but that potentially could be a danger zone.
Yeah, I think so too. My quick answer would have been, they just need to know that there are three humans under the age of 18. But that's not going to satisfy a landlord. They're going to want more. So I haven't been asked that question before. So I'd have to give that some thought, and probably would like to call Sierra Legal on that too myself. So awesome. So are there any other resources or thoughts that you want to share before we come up and wrap up soon?
Sure. So, and I have to let you know, I've been plugging this week at my outreaches. So that was one of my resources, was go
Thank you.
OC. So, another thing that is coming up is let's see, I don't know why I don't have it on here, but Ledge Day. If someone could post Ledge Day in the chat. So, this is a way. I mean, fair housing really has people, inspired, and also there's a lot of issues going on, in California, in our businesses, and CAR is working really hard on the real estate community's behalf, the realtor community's behalf, to make sure it's that, first of all, we have more inventory, that we address the affordability issues, that you can continue to do your business even though we have COVID, all of the things, including fair housing. So definitely check that out. It's on the 27th. You have to register ahead of time. And it's a whole entire day with a reception at the end. And there is a fair housing component to it as well. The business meetings are happening now and will happen through next week. So feel free to come to those. Oftentimes, there are topics that touch fair housing that are discussed, and it would be great to have all of your input. I know there's a couple things. So taxation was my jam when I was on the board. And I have to say, not everybody goes to taxation. But first of all, taxation is an area where we really need everybody's input in, because all of us and our clients pay taxes. You don't want them to be onerous. And also think about when you have onerous taxes, or taxes that you don't think you should be able to have, or you don't know about the taxes that are coming, and how does that impact some of our underserved communities, first-time buyers, or folks who have less of a cushion. So so those are things to check out all through next week. And then there's a couple of fair housing summits, and I'll put those in the chat at the end of next week as well. There's an ARIA Fair Housing Summit, and actually the LGBTQ plus housing policy symposium, which of course will probably touch on some fair housing issues, particularly the Equality Act. So big push to put sexual orientation and gender identity into the Fair Housing Act. So you can join those. I'm putting those in the chat. And I think that's it. I put some other resources, including Fairhaven. If you watch Adam Explains Everything, the YouTube video I posted, it's all of 6 minutes and gives you a really good overview of the history. And I put some other great books and resources that I thought were good in the chat.
Excellent. We know that you are a plethora of resources. That's what we rely on. And so thank you for plugging all of those items in. I have one more question in the Q&A regarding what to tell the offering agent if they send a buyer love letter with their offer. And so, I'll field that one. The Q&A that I mentioned and we popped into the chat does a great job in covering that. And essentially, as a listing agent, you want to get your seller's permission to reject those letters. And you want to get that in writing. That way, if you have a buyer's agent who challenges it, who says, well, you're telling me that the seller doesn't want to see it. How do I know? Well, you have it in writing that the seller says, I do not want to see it. Now, you're obligated to let the seller know there is an offer, but you don't have to show them the offer if you can't remove that letter from it. And I had a friend reach out to me the other day telling me she got a 93-page offer package. Okay, number one, what do you even include for 93 pages? Well, apparently it was every page of their 12 bank statements was also in there. But stuck right in the middle of it was the buyer love letter. And so, the listing agent caught it and let the buyer's agent, with the offer, know, we're not going to be presenting those. My seller does not want to see them. She didn't ask for proof, but she had the proof that the seller says, I don't want to see them. So the offer was sent back, but you invite them to resubmit. Just resubmit your offer without that letter and we'll forward it on. But you do need to let your seller know that an offer has come in.
And I would think the seller would be happy to, just like you advise the seller on their disclosure requirements, letting them know about they may not be as well versed on all of the rules and laws around fair housing or even the requirements of a seller as a listing agent would be. So, sometimes, when you broach that conversation with the seller, letting them know, they often will appreciate knowing that more, and then you can go into the conversation around whether they want to restrict the buyer letters, because it could lead to them basing the decision on something that could be inappropriate under the law.
Right. And I think that Fair Housing Discrimination Advisory is the great conversation starter for that, because it's there in writing. It talks about it. It mentions it as a best practice to not provide it. That opens that conversation. And then the further conversation of whether they want to even see them if they come in. So, Barbara asked the question, will we get to a point where we input in our listing that they won't be accepted? And I think we're there. We're there. I have a little inkling that we will definitely be there in a few months. But essentially, yes, I am starting to see it in MLS in the private remarks that per the seller's instructions, seller doesn't want to see any love letters. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't people who are explicitly asking for them, because I've heard other agents saying, well, they're telling me I have to submit a letter, and I'm trying to educate them on why it's a problem, and they're not having it. So it's a real mess. But I think we're making some progress. So any final thoughts, Farah?
Well, so what you just said just reminds me of the fact that, so this is why we have the conversation, right? So, and that's how we learn. So it's okay. At one point we were all doing buyer letters. When I was a realtor, I was doing the buyer letters too. And this represents a shift. So, folks are going to not all do it at the same time. Some folks are going to need to be educated and also even to kind of understand it, requires a conversation, which I think is a good thing. The more we can talk about even the bigger picture around fair housing and helping folks understand the context of why buyer letters could be problematic and the importance of fair housing and the significance of it all, it is positive. So I would just say, continue to have those conversations, and help each other get on board with these concepts. If you get folks who are like, I want to know more information about the buyer, let them know, and make sure that they're familiar with the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. And I just appreciate the opportunity to engage in the discussion with you guys. And I'm always here to be a resource. You'll see my email address in the chat.
Well, we're so grateful that you joined us today and brought all of your insight to us and shared all of the various resources that CAR has worked so tirelessly on over the last year, in addition to COVID. all of the COVID forms. But this conversation is long overdue. You mentioned something that reminded me of a session I was on earlier this week, where we don't make progress if we don't have the conflict, which leads to the conversation. And so, you said the same thing essentially. So thank you for sharing your time with us and your resources, your knowledge, your point of view. It's so important to hear. And I'd like to just thank our audience for sharing the entire week with us. We started out on Monday with an NAR update. We had Brian Green and Matt DeFanis to give us updates from NAR. And on Tuesday, we had the deep dive of the Code of Ethics Standard of Practice 10-5. Wednesday, Lee Brown told us we're no longer just a realtor. And of course, Thursday, we had the implicit bias training. And today, we had a great engaging conversation about the buyer love letters. So thank you so much for being here all week. Even if you just came one day, that's okay. We appreciate it. Go to our website to find more information, and please check out all of the wonderful resources that were posted in the chat. So with that, Farah, thank you. Thanks for being here, my friend.
It was absolutely a pleasure. Always great chatting with you, and it's just wonderful to kind of share this fair housing month and week with you and OC. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. We appreciate you. All right, everyone. Have a very successful weekend.
Bye.
Bye now.